Emma carefully lifted the heavy, leather-bound album from the top shelf of her late grandmother's study, a thin layer of dust swirling into the air as she moved it. The room was quiet, save for the gentle tapping of an early autumn rain against the window pane. She had been tasked with sorting through her grandmother's extensive collection of books and artifacts, an eclectic accumulation that chronicled not just a family history, but the lore of her small New England town. As she flipped through the album, a sheaf of papers tucked between the pages caught her attention. Emma pulled them out, revealing a series of hand-drawn maps and notes. The ink faded, but still legible. Her grandmother had been a historian in her own right, fascinated by the local legends and the deep woods that bordered their property. One map in particular stood out. It was more detailed and carefully annotated than the others, showing a path that wound through the old woods to a place marked as Hawthorne's Clearing. Intrigued, Emma decided to trace this path. Her grandmother had often spoken of Hawthorne's Clearing as a site of historical significance, rumored to be the meeting place of the town's founders when they first settled in the area. Despite her extensive research, she had never been able to locate it before her health declined. Determined to see it for herself, Emma gathered her gear for a hike the following morning. She felt a connection to her grandmother, a shared curiosity that seemed to guide her steps. That evening, as she prepared her backpack, there was a knock at the door. It was Mr. Hawthorne, her grandmother's lifelong friend and the town's unofficial keeper of history. He was an elderly man with a sharp gaze that belied his years and a slow, thoughtful way of speaking. "I heard you found the map to the clearing," Mr. Hawthorne said, stepping inside after Emma invited him in. His eyes were drawn immediately to the map laid out on the dining room table. "Yes, I'm planning to head out there tomorrow," Emma replied, noting the concern that flickered across Mr. Hawthorne's face. He nodded slowly, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old lantern. It was a beautiful, if somewhat tarnished, piece, with intricate metalwork and glass panels. "Take this with you," he said, placing the lantern on the table. "It's been in your family for generations. Used to light the way for your ancestors, and it might just do the same for you." Emma was hesitant, aware of the old man's penchant for dramatics. "Mr. Hawthorne, it's just an old lantern. I have a flashlight." "Not just any lantern," Mr. Hawthorne interrupted, his voice low and earnest. "This one's different. It's protected your family for years from things in those woods. Things that aren't just bears or lost hikers. But remember, never let its light go out. It's more than a beacon. It's a guard." Skeptical but intrigued by the earnestness in his tone, Emma agreed to take the lantern. Mr. Hawthorne showed her how to light it, mentioning a special oil that burned with a clear, bright flame. "Keep it lit, Emma. Promise me that." "I promise," she said, though her practical mind doubted the need for such theatrics. The next morning, under a gray sky that threatened more rain, Emma set out. The lantern swung gently at her side, its flame steady and bright against the morning's light. She followed the map through familiar parts of the woods until the path became less and less distinct, overtaken by wild growth and the untamed sprawl of nature. As she walked, the woods seemed to close in around her. The trees, ancient and towering, cast long shadows that danced in the wind. The path, now barely more than a deer trail, twisted through thickets of bramble and over streams swollen from recent rains. Emma felt a thrill of adventure, her heart beating with excitement and a touch of nervousness. The lantern's light, a small but constant presence at her side, seemed almost unnecessary in the daylight, but its glow was comforting, a tangible link to her grandmother and the stories she had cherished. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, recounting tales of the early settlers and the agreements they forged with the land, the peace they made with the shadows in the woods. Emma walked on, drawn deeper into the forest by the promise of discovery and the guiding light of the old lantern, unaware of just how soon she would need its protection. In the fading light of the afternoon, with the sun dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows on the forest floor, Emma paused to consult her grandmother's map once again. The path, increasingly obscure, seemed to weave through the older part of the woods, an area rife with folklore and whispered legends that Emma had always believed were mere tales to keep curious children at bay. As she continued along the path, Emma couldn't help but feel the weight of solitude, the silence of the woods punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a raven. The lantern swung gently in her hand, its flame casting a warm glow against the cooling air of the coming evening. Recalling Mr. Hawthorne's words about the lantern, Emma felt a mix of skepticism and intrigue. To distract herself from the encroaching darkness and the creeping sense of isolation, she began to recall the stories her grandmother had told her about the lantern. It was said to have been crafted by her ancestor, a noted blacksmith, and one of the town's early settlers. The lantern was not only a source of light, but a symbol of safe passage and protection against the unknown forces that roamed the woods at night. According to family lore, the lantern had a life of its own. It was first owned by Elizabeth Hawthorne, Emma's great-great-grandmother, who was known in town for her herbal remedies and whispered to be a cunning woman who brokered peace with the spirits of the wood. Elizabeth was said to roam the woods at night, guided by the lantern's light, which never flickered nor faded, no matter how dark the night or fierce the storm. One particular story stood out in Emma's mind, a tale from a winter night when a great blizzard had swept through the region. Elizabeth had ventured into the woods to gather herbs that were crucial for a child sick with fever. With her way lit only by the lantern, she wandered deeper into the forest than she intended and found herself surrounded by a pack of shadowy figures with glowing eyes, the hounds of the wood, as the legends named them. The creatures circled her, but they did not attack. Instead, they paced at the very edge of the lantern's light. Elizabeth, realizing the lantern's power, held it high and spoke words known only to her that bound the creatures to the shadows, ensuring they would not harm any who carried the lantern in the woods again. The pact held, and since that night, no Hawthorne who carried the lantern ever came to harm in the woods. With the tale fresh in her mind, Emma clutched the lantern a little closer, a part of her wanting to believe in the magic her grandmother had so often spoken of. The path before her began to slope downward, leading to a darker part of the woods where the trees grew so dense that little sunlight penetrated even during the day. As she descended, the air grew markedly colder, and the forest seemed to close in around her. The comforting crackle of the lantern's flame was a stark contrast to the silence that enveloped her. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond the light's reach, and Emma quickened her pace, the map's markings indicating she was nearing Hawthorne's clearing. Suddenly, a soft rustling noise from behind made her stop short. Heart pounding, she turned slowly, lantern held out before her. But there was nothing, only the gentle sway of trees in the evening breeze. Emma took a deep breath, chastising herself for her nerves, yet couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. With a renewed sense of urgency, she continued her trek, the stories of the lantern and her family's legacy melding with the reality of her solitary journey. The woods seemed alive, aware of her presence, and as the sky darkened to a deep twilight, the full weight of her grandmother's tales of agreements made in these very woods long ago settled upon her. Emma approached the edge of Hawthorne's clearing, the trees thinning as the ground flattened into a wide, open space. The remains of what looked to be an old stone altar stood at the center, the stones moss-covered and weather-worn, but clearly man-made. The lantern flickered as she stepped into the clearing, a chill running down her spine as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it voices that seemed to murmur her name. The tales were no longer just stories. They felt all too real in the twilight of the clearing, under the watchful eyes of the woods. Emma set the lantern down beside the stone altar, her fingers tracing the ancient carvings, feeling the etched lines that had been touched by generations of her ancestors. Here in the heart of the woods, surrounded by the shadows and the fading light, Emma prepared to uncover the truths that had been hidden by time, guided by the last light of the lantern. As Emma set the lantern down next to the stone altar, the light it cast seemed to grow stronger, as if resonating with the ancient stones. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. This was what she had come for, to connect with the history her grandmother had so loved, to stand where her ancestors had stood. But the isolation of the clearing, surrounded by the dense, encroaching forest, felt overwhelming. The dusk deepened, and the woods seemed to draw in closer, the trees whispering secrets in a language only they understood. The air was cool, carrying the damp scent of moss and old leaves, a reminder that night was swiftly approaching. Emma retrieved the lantern and pulled out her grandmother's notes from her backpack, using the lantern's light to read. The notes mentioned rituals performed at the clearing, gatherings during celestial events, and peace pacts made with the woodland spirits. The history was rich, interwoven with legend and fact in a way that made it difficult to separate the two. Determined to document the site, Emma began setting up her camera and other equipment. As she worked, the silence of the forest was broken by the rustle of leaves and the crack of branches underfoot. Emma paused, her blood running cold, listening intently. The sounds were sporadic, suggesting the movements of something, or someone, circling the clearing. With a deep breath, Emma reminded herself of the countless evenings she'd spent camping alone in the mountains during her university days. She was no stranger to the woods, yet there was something unnervingly different about these sounds, about this night. Taking up the lantern once more, she decided to make a quick perimeter check. As she moved towards the edge of the clearing, the lantern's light seemed to pulse, its glow intensifying with each step towards the trees. Remembering Mr. Hawthorne's words, Emma held the lantern out, letting the light pierce the gathering darkness. The rustling stopped abruptly as the light washed over the underbrush, revealing nothing but the forest's natural inhabitants, a few small rodents scurrying away from the light. Relieved but still uneasy, Emma returned to the center of the clearing to continue her work. As she set about her tasks, Emma felt the weight of the forest's gaze upon her, as if the trees themselves were sentient, watching her every move. She tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on setting up her recording equipment to capture the night sounds of the woods for her research. Once her equipment was in place, Emma took out a small folding chair and sat down to review her grandmother's notes by the lantern's light. She was particularly drawn to an entry describing the lantern's role in the rituals performed here, how it was believed to guide the spirits of the forest, helping them find their way in the darkness. As night fully settled in, the forest seemed to come alive. The sounds were no longer just the occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal calls, but a symphony of whispers, groans, and sighs that filled the air with an ancient melody. Emma's recorder picked up the sounds, capturing the eerie chorus. Mesmerized by the atmosphere, Emma didn't notice the gradual dimming of the lantern's light. It wasn't until the edges of her vision began to blur into the shadows that she realized the lantern was faltering. Panicking, she quickly checked the oil reservoir. It was lower than she had expected, but there should have been enough to last through the night. Heart racing, Emma tried to recall the exact words Mr. Hawthorne had used when he instructed her on the lantern's maintenance. She fumbled with the lantern, adjusting the wick, shaking the frame slightly, hoping to coax more life from the flame. Suddenly, from the darkness beyond the circle of light, a soft, melodic voice spoke. "Do not fear, child of the Hawthorns." Emma spun around, lantern held high, casting about for the source of the voice. There was a moment of silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, from the shadows stepped a figure, cloaked in mist, its features blurred, but its presence unmistakably human. "You have come far, Emma Hawthorne," the figure continued, its voice a whisper on the wind. "And the path you seek to tread is filled with more than just the echoes of the past. The woods have awaited your return, for the pact your ancestors made must be renewed. The lantern's light is but the first step on this journey." Emma stood, frozen in place, her mind racing. The stories were real, more real than she had ever imagined. As she faced the spectral figure, the lantern flickered once more, and then, with a soft sigh, the light strengthened, glowing brighter than before, illuminating the clearing and the figure before her with a warm, golden light. "You are not alone here," the figure said, stepping into the light. "Your ancestors walk with you, as do the spirits of this place. But remember, the balance of peace is delicate, and the darkness is deep. Keep the light burning, Emma. Keep the path clear." With that, the figure faded away, dissolving into the mist as quietly as it had appeared. Emma, left alone in the clearing with only the lantern and her thoughts, felt a new resolve settle in her heart. Her journey into the woods was no longer just a historical exploration, but a personal pilgrimage, a quest to understand the legacy she had inherited and the mysteries that lay deep within the forest. Under the renewed glow of the lantern, Emma sat back in her chair, the warmth of the light soothing her initial shock. The spectral visitor had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving a heavy air of solemnity hanging in the clearing. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The reality of her family's legends was no longer confined to the pages of dusty journals or the fanciful tales of old neighbors. It was real, tangible, and most importantly, it was her legacy to uphold. With a newfound determination, Emma turned her attention back to her grandmother's notes. According to the aged, yellowed pages, the clearing had been a site of great importance, not just a meeting place, but a sacred ground where pacts between the early settlers and the spirits of the woods were renewed with each generation. Her ancestors had walked these grounds, lanterns in hand, to ensure peace and balance within the town. Now, it seemed it was her turn. As night deepened around her, the shadows at the edge of the clearing grew denser. Emma could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, watching her every move with silent intensity. She reminded herself of the protective power of the lantern, reassured by its steady light piercing the darkness. Remembering the spectral figure's warning to keep the path clear, Emma decided to explore the surrounding area, to better understand the layout and any significant features that might be mentioned in her grandmother's journals. She carefully packed her equipment, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and lifted the lantern, its light casting long, dancing shadows as she moved. As she walked around the perimeter of the clearing, she noticed several smaller paths branching off into the woods. Each path seemed to lead deeper into darkness, the trees thicker and more imposing than around the main clearing. Emma chose a path marked by an ancient, gnarled oak tree, which seemed familiar from one of the sketches in her grandmother's notes. The path was narrow and overgrown, evidence that few had traveled this way in recent years. Brambles and thorns grabbed at her clothes as she pushed her way through, her only guidance the dim light of the lantern. As she progressed, the air grew colder, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself, pushing forward with a mix of trepidation and excitement. Deep in the woods, Emma discovered a small brook, its waters clear and flowing gently over smooth stones. The sound of the water was calming, a natural melody that played counterpoint to the eerie silence of the woods. Near the brook, partially hidden by moss and undergrowth, she found a series of small stone cairns. They were obviously man-made, arranged in a deliberate pattern that her trained eye recognized as possibly ritualistic. Curious, Emma consulted her grandmother's notes again. Sure enough, the cairns were mentioned as markers, guiding the way to a hidden grove used for more private ceremonies and meditations by her ancestors. Feeling like a true historian on the brink of a significant discovery, Emma followed the cairns, each step revealing more of the hidden secrets her family had kept. The path led her to a small grove, the trees here older, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. In the center of the grove was a stone table, worn by time and weather, but still sturdy. Carvings decorated its surface, symbols that matched those on the lantern and in the journals. As Emma approached the table, the lantern flickered slightly, a shiver running down her spine. She set the lantern down on the table, its light reflecting off the stone and casting eerie patterns on the trees surrounding her. She took out her camera, documenting the carvings, the arrangement of the grove, and the overall atmosphere for her records. Lost in her work, Emma didn't notice the gathering darkness around her, the light of her lantern now a beacon in the encroaching night. It wasn't until a sudden drop in temperature alerted her to the late hour that she realized how long she'd been engrossed in her exploration. Packing up her equipment, Emma prepared to head back to the main clearing, her mind buzzing with the day's discoveries and the implications for her research. As she lifted the lantern, however, she paused. The air around her had stilled unnaturally, and the familiar sense of being watched returned, more intense than before. Turning slowly, lantern held high, Emma scanned the grove. The shadows seemed to move, swirling in patterns that made her eyes ache if she focused too long. Whispering voices filled the air, a cacophony of sound that seemed both warning and welcoming. With a deep breath, Emma stepped back onto the path leading to the clearing, her heart pounding not just with fear, but with the thrill of the unknown. The legacy of her family was no longer just a tale to be told. It was her story to live, and she was ready to face whatever the woods held in store. As Emma retraced her steps through the dense underbrush, the whispers faded into the rustling of leaves, leaving a silence that throbbed with the heartbeat of the ancient forest. The stone table and the symbols she had documented resonated in her mind, a puzzle that demanded to be solved, linked to the deeper history her family had intertwined with these woods. Emerging into the clearing, the comfort of the familiar space welcomed her. Yet the serenity of the clearing was overshadowed by the urgency of her mission, to understand and perhaps to complete the rituals her ancestors had started, ensuring the peace they had brokered with the woodland spirits continued. As she prepared to explore the final landmark her grandmother had meticulously marked on the old map, a mysterious circle of stones reputed to be a focal point of spiritual activity, Emma fortified herself with a light meal. Sitting on the mossy ground, her back against an old elm, she reviewed her notes under the lantern's reassuring glow. The circle was supposedly located on the northern edge of the clearing, hidden by dense thicket and shadowed by the tallest oaks of the forest. With her equipment repacked and the lantern refueled, ensuring its light would not falter, Emma set out towards the northern boundary of the clearing. The woods seemed to watch her as she moved, the trees whispering secrets to each other, leaves rustling in a language she yearned to understand. The path became rougher, the forest denser. Brambles clawed at her jeans, and low-hanging branches tugged at her hair. The lantern swayed in her grip, casting jumping shadows that danced around her, making the path seem alive. As she pushed through a particularly tangled section of underbrush, the woods opened up suddenly, revealing the circle of stones. The stones were larger than she had imagined. Massive, really, each towering over her, covered in patches of moss and lichen, standing as silent sentinels. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each stone equidistant from the next, their broad faces turned inward towards the center of the circle where a smaller, flat stone lay, possibly an altar of sorts. Emma approached slowly, an inexplicable reverence slowing her steps. The air here was cooler, the atmosphere charged, as if the very earth pulsed with unseen energy. She placed the lantern on the ground near the central stone and began setting up her camera, documenting each stone from multiple angles, capturing the eerie beauty of the arrangement. As she worked, the sky darkened, clouds rolling in to shroud the moon. The lantern's light seemed to grow brighter against the encroaching darkness, its golden glow a solitary beacon in the night. Emma felt the isolation of the place then, a loneliness that was profound, yet not entirely unwelcome. It was as if she had stepped out of time, into a chapter of history untouched by the modern world. With her initial recordings complete, Emma took out her grandmother's journal, comparing her notes with the actual arrangement of the stones. According to the journal, this circle was a sacred site used for the midsummer rite, a ceremony conducted to ensure the harmony between the human and spirit realms. The rites required the guardian of the lantern to light a fire at the center of a circle and offer herbs and oils that represented the bounty of the land. Compelled by the history and the palpable energy of the circle, Emma decided to perform the rite as described in the journal. She gathered twigs and leaves, piling them on the central stone, then added a few drops of the oil Mr. Hawthorne had given her for the lantern. Taking a deep breath, she lit the small pile with a match, the flames catching quickly, casting a warm, flickering light that seemed to pulse in time with her heart. As the fire burned, Emma recited the words written in her grandmother's journal, words meant to honor the spirits and affirm the peace. Her voice felt small at first, then grew in confidence, carried by the wind through the stone circle. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, fanning the flames into a brief, roaring fire that startled Emma back a step. As the fire settled back down to a crackle, the wind carried a new sound, a deep, resonant humming that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. Emma watched, awestruck, as faint, phosphorescent lights appeared over the stones, swirling in intricate patterns in the air. The display was mesmerizing, beautiful and otherworldly, and she felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her, a feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. The Midsummer Rite, performed so many years after it was last conducted, had awakened an ancient magic, a connection between Emma and the guardians who had come before her. As the fire died down and the lights faded, Emma felt a profound shift within herself, a deeper understanding of her role as the guardian of the lantern and the protector of these woods. Packing up her equipment, Emma left the circle of stones with a promise to return. She walked back to the clearing under the watchful eyes of the forest, the lantern swinging gently in her hand, its light steady and sure, guiding her safely home. Returning to the clearing from the stone circle, Emma felt every shadow of the old forest observing her passage. The lantern's light, once merely a tool in her mind, now felt like a living companion, its glow a tangible barrier against the gathering darkness. Her walk back was filled with contemplation, her mind replaying the spectral lights and resonant hums from the ritual, signs she could no longer dismiss as mere happenstance. By the time she reached the old stone cottage, night had fully settled in, draping the forest in a velvet darkness only pierced by the lantern's steadfast glow. She decided to spend the night within the walls of the cottage, her trust in the lantern solidifying into a silent pact, its light in exchange for her continued reverence and care. Inside the cottage, Emma set the lantern on an old, dust-covered table. The small room, with its stone fireplace and a single, narrow bed, spoke of simpler times. It felt untouched by time, preserved perhaps by the same spirits that roamed these woods. As she prepared a modest dinner using her portable stove, Emma felt an inexplicable sense of being home, as if the cottage had been waiting for her. After eating, she pulled out her grandmother's journals once more, the pages now more alive to her than ever. Tonight, the entries she read whispered of warnings and omens, the old words hinting at the delicate balance she now tread. Her grandmother had written of the lantern's dual nature, a beacon of protection, but also a beacon that could attract unwanted attention from deeper, darker corners of the forest. With the fire from the stove casting dancing shadows on walls, Emma's thoughts wandered to the shadowy figures she had seen her first night in the woods. They had kept to the darkness, just beyond the lantern's reach, and now she wondered if her actions had drawn them closer, their intentions unknown. Determined to understand more, Emma retrieved a small, leather-bound book from her backpack, one that contained the protective chants her grandmother had transcribed from older, more arcane texts. If the forest indeed had more to reveal, she would be ready. As the night deepened, a chill descended on the cottage, seeping through the chinks in the stone walls and creeping along the floorboards. Emma added another log to the stove, her eyes catching movement through the small window. Peering out, she held her breath, watching as shadows moved within shadows, the shapes undefined but unmistakably deliberate in their slow, prowling movements around the cottage. The lantern flickered, drawing her attention back inside. Emma's heart raced as she considered the implications of her grandmother's warnings. Taking up the lantern, she spoke softly, repeating the protective chants she had just read, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. The light steadied, growing brighter, casting the interior of the cottage into stark relief against the darkness outside. Hours passed, Emma vigilant, occasionally peering out the window or repeating the chants. The shadows outside moved restless, but did not approach the cottage again. It seemed the lantern's light and her chants were enough to keep whatever roamed the night at bay. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell asleep seated at the table, her head resting on an open page of the journal, the lantern dimming but constant beside her. She woke to the first light of dawn filtering through the window, the night's terrors retreating with the shadows. Emma felt a momentary relief washed over her. A night survived, a rite of passage completed. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her chest as she breakfasted on simple fare and prepared for another day. Outside, the forest seemed less ominous in the daylight, the bird song and rustle of small creatures a comforting return to normalcy. But the night's events had changed something fundamental in Emma's perception of her task. She was no longer just a chronicler of history. She was now a participant in an ongoing story, a story that stretched back through generations, woven through with magic and mystery. Gathering her gear, Emma decided to explore the area once more, to map the peripheries of the clearing and the paths that snaked deeper into the forest. If the spirits of the wood were drawing closer, she would meet them on her terms, with open eyes and a clear mind, armed with the knowledge and protection passed down by her ancestors. As she stepped out of the cottage, the lantern in her hand, Emma felt a resolve solidifying within her. The whispers and warnings of the night had become part of her narrative, a narrative she was determined to understand and to tell, not with fear, but with the courage and curiosity that had led her to this place. She was ready to face whatever the day brought, for she was no longer alone. She was a part of the forest's history, and a part of hers. As Emma ventured deeper into the forest, her determination was palpable. The morning was bright, with rays of sunlight piercing through the dense canopy, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. Armed with her grandmother's journal, the protective chants fresh in her mind, and the ever-present lantern swinging from her hand, she felt prepared, even eager, to uncover more of the forest's secrets. The paths that branched off from the clearing were overgrown and seldom trodden, as evidenced by the encroaching ferns and the thick underbrush. Each step took her further from the familiar, deeper into the realm of the unknown. Emma carefully marked her route using small, biodegradable flags, ensuring she could find her way back if needed. Her heart raced with a mix of adrenaline and apprehension as she considered the possibilities that lay hidden in the untouched depths of the forest. As she walked, Emma reviewed the events of the previous night, the shadowy figures that prowled just beyond the light, the protective power of the lantern, and the spectral figure's cryptic message. The experience had shaken her, but it had also awakened a fierce curiosity and a sense of responsibility. She was, as the figure had said, a hawthorn, and the forest's legacy was now hers to protect and understand. After several hours of trekking through increasingly rugged terrain, Emma found herself in a part of the forest that felt distinctly different. The air was cooler here, the silence more profound. A sense of anticipation hung heavily around her, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She noticed an unusual arrangement of flora that formed a natural pathway leading to a grove that was not marked on any of her maps. The grove was circular, with towering ancient trees that seemed to guard it. In the center, a large flat stone rested, covered in moss and surrounded by a ring of wildflowers that were strangely vibrant against the forest's muted tones. Emma approached slowly, her lantern casting light on the stone surface, revealing faint, almost erased carvings that resembled the symbols from the stone circle. Realizing the significance of the find, Emma set down her backpack and began to carefully document the site. She took photographs, sketched the carvings, and took notes on the grove's layout and the species of plants that seemed to flourish in this magical circle. The work was meticulous, demanding her full attention, yet part of her mind remained alert, wary of the forest around her. As she worked, the forest's whispers returned, now clear and more urgent. They spoke in hushed tones, a language she did not understand but felt compelled to respond to. She took out the small book of chants and began to recite one softly, feeling the words resonate with the energy of the grove. The atmosphere shifted then, the air vibrating with a palpable energy. The lantern flickered, as if in response to her chanting, its flame dancing wildly. Emma's heart skipped a beat, her senses heightened to the changes happening around her. She continued to chant, more confidently now, her voice carrying through the grove. Suddenly, the lantern went out. The grove plunged into darkness, the sunlight seemingly swallowed by the dense canopy above. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled for her matches, her fingers trembling. But before she could strike a light, a soft glow emanated from the stone itself, illuminating the grove in a gentle, ethereal light. Standing in awe, Emma watched as the carvings on the stone began to glow, each symbol brightening until the entire stone was alight with an otherworldly luminescence. The air thrummed with power, and the whispers crescendoed into a harmonious chant that seemed to echo her own. From the light emerged the spectral figure she had seen before, its form more defined now, radiating a calm authority. "Emma Hawthorne," it said, its voice both in her mind and all around her. "You have accepted the mantle of guardian, and you have lit the path not just for yourself, but for all who will follow." The figure gestured to the lantern, and Emma watched in astonishment as it relit itself, its flame steady and strong. "This lantern will guide you always, but remember, its light is a reflection of your own strength and belief. You must continue to seek, to learn, and to protect. The balance depends on it." Overwhelmed but filled with a profound sense of purpose, Emma nodded, her resolve strengthened like never before. She understood now that her journey was not just about uncovering the past, but about ensuring the future. The forest, her family's legacy, and the spirits within it were her responsibility, a responsibility she now embraced fully. As the spectral light faded and the sunlight returned, Emma packed her equipment, the lantern once again secure in her grip. She left the grove with a new sense of belonging and a mission that transcended her initial scholarly pursuits. The forest no longer felt like a place of mystery and fear, but a home, a sacred space she was sworn to protect and honor. Stepping out of the grove, Emma looked back once, the glow from the stone still visible between the trees. She smiled, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, the last light of the lantern not an end, but a beginning.